Lenin Moreno takes office in Ecuador and goes with this notion that he's going to be similar to the person who was before him, Correa. He gets in office and he is anything but. He takes a rightward shift, and for the most part, you would be remiss if you didn't think he was a right-winger. He gives over Julian Assange. And it is suspected that he gives over Julian Assange for loans. Now, he takes loans from the IMF when those loans are not necessary, and he takes those loans, and there are attachments to those loans, meaning the IMF essentially is saying, look, if you take these loans, there's an austerity package that comes along with these loans, and he diligently implements that austerity package. Neoliberal policies that, for the most part, roughly, you could say double the price of gas. The society itself flips out. And then flipping out, the indigenous populations, students' populations, all of these groups come together and bring Ecuador to a standstill. Now, I have been to Ecuador. Quito. Gas is cheap in Quito. Now, because gas is cheap in Quito, to get from point A to point B, you can $5 will get you literally from like one side of the town or the city to the other. Think about what that means if it doubles. You have a society that does not have the flexibility in their income. Gas is being subsidized, and you are getting rid of the subsidy almost overnight, which is going to create this thing where the level of poverty in the country is going to jump when people don't have the ability to get from point A to point B because they can't necessarily afford to do it, or they can't afford to fill up their cars, or the amount of money that they're charging for taxis. People who live there can't afford it. Like, this is all sorts of cascading consequences. I was seeing the same thing when I was in Kenya. They were doing this thing where they were implementing a policy where they were either getting rid of the fuel subsidy or increasing the price of fuel, which was causing protests because of cab drivers and Uber drivers who didn't have the flexibility of their income, and so they were adversely being affected by that in a much larger way. It's something similar here. This is Real News Network, just explaining the basics of this.
Many student organizations, the Unitary Front of Workers, or FUT, and many citizens in general, especially farmers and workers. The protests erupted after President Lenin Moreno declared a host of economic and social austerity measures proposed by the IMF as conditions for loans. These included eliminating subsidies, raising gas and food prices, and restructuring work laws based on more neoliberal standards, among other things. Building up to the protests, anger.
Basically, he was going to dramatically increase poverty, and these organizations shut that country down. So much so that Moreno moved his government, or moved his buildings, to a nearby town because he was scared that the workers were going to be able to essentially take over the government, take it over Quito. Look at this. There were fights in the street between cops. They were bringing in military and police to deal with this. And in bringing in military and police to deal with this, they were shooting. Many people died in regards to the protests. The cops were killing some of the protesters. Here's another interesting point. The government, just now, a few minutes ago, capitulated. This strike had been going on for 11 days. And then gone on for 11 days, Moreno had taken heavy-handed methods of shutting down media like Telesur. But they were unending. The United Nations got involved and assisted with a dialogue. And the government capitulated. The Ecuador government dropped IMF decree. At that point, it was ungovernable. Ungovernable, meaning the people themselves rose up and asserted themselves because they were going to be dramatically hurt by the proposition that he was putting into play. Not to mention, they didn't necessarily want those IMF loans in the first place. Moreno could not govern Quito, so much so that he had to flee to another area. And eventually, he just capitulated. That's amazing. You're talking about workers' revolt. The United Nations-backed dialogue table installed between Lenin Moreno's government and leaders of the indigenous organizations reached a historic deal Sunday to revoke pro-IMF Decree 883, end strikes across the country, and to set up a commission that will write new documents that will replace it. The UN representative in Ecuador, Ahmad Perel, informed that the new decree will be drawn about organizations of the indigenous movement, participants from the dialogue, and the government, with mediation from the international body and the Catholic Church. In a televised speech on October 3rd, Moreno announced, they're going to announce. One day later, prices increased by 25 to 120% starting as the gallon of gasoline will go from $1.85 to $2.30, while diesel used by most freight transport will increase from $1.03 to $2.27. That's more than double. A measure that was part of the United States $4.2 billion deal with the IMF fund. Massive protests, mainly led by the indigenous sector, began and have reached 12 days until Sunday. We've got more than 2,000 injured, 1,000 prisoners, 10 killed, 100 missing. We have a human rights violation. We ask the resignation of Minister Romo and Minister Jarin. Only then will we have peace and freedom. Ecuadorian Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, CONAL, President Jamie Vargas said, thanking all that joined the protests and helped those that came to Quito. Isn't that amazing? The question becomes, what is the new decree, right? What's the new decree? I mean, ultimately, Lenin Moreno gave a bait and switch. He's not anything like his previous predecessor. And in this particular case, he was massively submissive to the Western powers. Well, in this case, he tried to pass those neoliberal policies over the population where he was going to increase gas more than double, overnight. And they shut that place down. I'm not going to keep this long. I mean, I was just like, wow. Citrus Peppercorn. Jamal, when are you going to do an AMA on the subreddit Way of the Burned? I got to be honest, I don't follow Reddit. When are you going to do an AMA? AMA. I don't know what an AMA is. Well, AMA to me is a medical thing. I don't know what that is. On the subreddit of Way of the Burn. But I don't know what Way of the Burn is. I'll look up Way of the Burn and see what you're talking about. Maybe it'll give context. But I don't know what that is. All right. Ask me anything. I see. Oh, I mean, you guys pretty much ask me anything anyway. What do you think the motive is destabilizing Ecuador? You mean the IMF? The IMF just seems to want to take power over various governments and privatize those resources. Meaning, the IMF getting its hooks in Ecuador essentially is, well, they're doing what they do, neoliberal policies. We want to privatize resources. Where in Ecuador's case, they were doing this with gas, meaning cutting the subsidy in gas. I mean, the public is clearly not on board for it. And the person who is in office now didn't run as if they were going to behave in such a way, meaning the country got a bait and switch. The goal of the IMF is what any bank wants, essentially a certain degree of control. The catch becomes, what is Moreno's objective? What is Moreno getting out of this? I mean, because ultimately he's selling out his country. All right, I have other ones I want to do before, and I don't want this one to go too long. I just wanted to give a heads up to what is going on. Ecuador, the general strike has worked. It has borne fruit, and they brought that government to its knees, and the government has capitulated. And again, the question becomes, what does it look like afterwards? Meaning, what is the secondary decree that these guys end up drawing up? And will they get those various people fired in the government that they wanted, seeing as they believe that they were being overtly violent in regards to dealing with the protests? But ultimately, they brought the government to its knees. The government submitted. Ecuadorian government agrees to repeal austerity law that sparked protests as indigenous groups pledged to stop rallies. You repeal that law, we'll stop our rallies. That's amazing. Shout out to Ecuador. Like, well, I was there, man. Like, it's weird. It's heady watching this. I mean, some of these areas I've been to. And it's like watching, I mean, look at this. They're building bricks and whatnot. This wasn't the Ecuador I remember. And I was only there like 2 years ago. Wow. When I was talking politics with the guys like in the cab and the people who own the hotel, I didn't understand enough about Ecuadorian politics to know who Moreno, Correa, and all of these people were. For the most part, they didn't consider these guys to be any good per se. They thought both of them were to some degree corrupt. But not like this. This is different. This is something different. Like, share, subscribe.